Michael Pollan, welcome to Longer Tables.
Thank you, Jane.
So I want to begin with, many people who are listening to this podcast think Michael Pollan, he's the food guru. But in fact, you come from a family of food gurus, and I'm thinking specifically of your mother, Corky. So I want you to tell us a little bit about her and what it was like to grow up in her kitchen.
Yeah, my mother was pretty passionate about food and a really good cook. And family dinner was sacrosanct in our house. It was every night at 6 o'clock. Well, with a couple exceptions, the weekends my parents would go out and we'd get to have TV dinners, which was a big treat on Saturday nights. And Sunday we would order in Chinese food, or deli, as it was called, and my father would be put in charge of that. And my mother had, she had 4 kids, so it was quite a show. And it was not just 4 kids, because we would usually each bring a friend to dinner. I mean, more often than not, we had these orphan friends whose parents didn't cook or cooked badly, or they just didn't want to be with their kid, or their kid didn't want to be with them. So we often had, instead of 6, we'd have 8 at dinner. Although my father usually missed family dinner because he had a very long commute from the city where he worked. He had like a 2-hour commute some nights. So we would eat without him, and he would eat leftovers when he got home. But there was a kind of regular rotation. If it was Monday, it was usually pasta, and Tuesday might be a stir fry. She liked to make Chinese food, either beef or chicken. There would be I'm trying to remember the rest of the days of the week and what we would have. But she would make ambitious food. Like we would have beef Wellington during the week.
Oh, wow. Because she was a columnist. I mean, she wrote about food and,
well, not at this point. I mean,
okay.
she became that. She became the Best Bets editor at New York Magazine, and was working very full time at that point. And by then we were not having the family dinner I'm remembering. This goes back to before we moved to New York City, and we were still living in the suburbs. And she wasn't working at that time. She had 4 kids. And but she was, watching Julia Child and reading Julia Child and trying out those recipes for us. And we were the beneficiaries. I loved her cooking, and it felt very contemporary at the time, making a stir fry. Like our friends weren't having stir fries.
Right.
And there was oven baked chicken with cornflake crust.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was very, very cutting edge at the time.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, she wasn't afraid of processed food ingredients. We would have, like a string bean casserole with those onion rings you'd get in a can, crumpled over them.
Yeah.
So it was very 60s food, and it was very cutting edge 60s food. And so I just love that. And I would help her in the kitchen. I mean, we all would at various times. There were certain dishes that we each liked to make. And my favorite, although it was a special occasion food, was chicken Kiev, which I thought was the coolest dish imaginable. And because it, had this little surprise package inside of this herby butter.
Well, you cut it open and the butter spurts out, right? Exactly. That's what you want, like the whole mess.
And of course, there's a lot of work to make sure that you have the tight enough seal before you deep fat fry it. And so I learned how to make that, hammer the chicken breast, freeze the butter with the herbs. And I would have that on my birthday, or if one of my sisters wanted it for their birthday. But food was an important part of our life. And, since then, my mother, along with my sisters, has written 2 cookbooks. So it remains it. But
it's interesting. I sort of had the sense that you didn't really learn to be a cook from your mother, like that your skills were pretty limited when you got out in the world. And in fact, maybe that's because you wrote a book called Cooked about learning to cook. So maybe I'm jumping to the conclusion, but was that a disappointment to her? Did she feel that you had come out of her house and were competent.
No, because I don't think she was setting out to teach us. I mean, it was to the extent we were interested. You could have another job like setting the table or cleaning up. So she didn't push it at all. And I like to cook. I had a pretty limited repertoire, I think. But I wasn't intimidated, about being in the kitchen. But like, did I have knife skills? Did I understand? I mean, there's a whole lot of things I didn't know how to do. So I had a lot to learn, definitely. And, but I had that period of time of living in a crappy apartment in New York with virtually no kitchen, just like a hot plate. So, and in Manhattan, you don't cook, as much. And so I fell away from it for a while.
It's interesting though, when people, I think that is might be a little bit of a surprise to people, but in fact, you came to food through gardening and nature writing. And I know you were a gardener at a very young age and very enthusiastic about that. But I
And grew
own
food, by the way. I had no interest in flowers.
only food.
Only food. Yeah, I saw no point in growing something that you couldn't eat or sell.
What was your most successful crop?
Well, I strawberries were a good, reliable perennial, and I loved growing them, and they were so cool. I mean, they're beautiful and tasty. I also grew hot peppers. I don't know why. I didn't particularly like them, and I once really burned myself on one that I had grown. I mean, it was just so fiercely. I didn't. I think I didn't know it was hot and bit into it, and that was a problem. I grew some melons. I wasn't interested in tomatoes. I mostly grew what I like to eat. I didn't discover tomatoes till I was in college.
Hmm.
But I mean, I did get into food via gardening. I mean, I had this background that I was fortunate to come from a family that did have family dinner and a good family dinner. But it was really gardening led to an interest in agriculture, led to an interest in food.
Right. Well, I was sort of setting you up with that gardening to food because I know you also, if only briefly, raised livestock or one particular animal. And it is a very
Poignant.
interesting story, tragic story. I don't want to spoiler, but tell us about your pig named Kosher, which is
Okay.
a great name for a pig.
That was my father's idea. We're going to have a
Okay.
pig named Kosher. Um, so I had some other livestock, by the way. So we lived in New York, in Long Island, in the suburbs until I was 15, and we moved into the city at that point. Before we moved, though, I did have a succession of unsuccessful livestock crops. I had a couple chickens. I don't know why I ended up with a rooster. My dad knew these farmers out on Long Island that were clients of his. He was a lawyer, and he would sometimes come home with an animal. And I would try to keep it alive as long as I could, which wasn't that long. We actually had an animal graveyard on our property
Oh,
uh,
no.
because we were constantly losing cats and dogs. And
Sorry.
but we would give them a decent burial. Um, Although I would build crosses because I didn't think animals were Jewish, and it was easy. It was easier than making a star.
Yes, much
Um,
easier.
but anyway, so that's important because this pig shows up after we have moved to Manhattan. Um, we are living on 89th Street and Park Avenue, and I am 15 or 16. And I did like pigs. I liked Emmett the pig. I liked Charlotte's Web. Uh, and it's one of those things where people start, you know, giving you things that you're actually only very mildly interested in. So pig figurines and pig, sculptures of various kinds, pins, toys. And so I had
All of which makes sense in a Manhattan apartment.
yeah, right. And then one day in June, my dad comes home with a surprise for me, and there is a shoebox. And I open the shoebox, and there's the cutest little white baby pig. It was a Yorkshire pig with pinkish ears and pinkish skin, and it was only a couple weeks old and had to be fed with a bottle, and which I was happy to do, and we named it Kosher. and kosher, but having a pig in Manhattan is, a questionable thing. I don't know. I don't even think there are co-op rules about it, but because no one has even considered it. But I'm sure it was against some rule that they had at the co-op. But anyway, the pig was too small to be a problem. At the time, we were spending summers on Martha's Vineyard, where my parents had built a house in the mid '60s, and so the pig came with me, and I was spending the summer there. I forget what job I had that summer, but I was working for the local newspaper or something like that. I had done that for a while, and the house was on stilts. It was a beach house, and right near the water. And I basically got some chicken wire and enclosed the uprights of the house to create a pen with shade, because I had learned, did a little research, and pigs are the only other animal besides humans that can be sunburned, and especially white ones. So that's one of the reasons they like mud so much, to cool off and keep their skin from being exposed. It's their sunblock, basically. um,
Right.
and Kosher lived under there, but he was a growing pig. I'm sorry, she was a growing pig. It was a female. It was hard to think of this animal as a female, but she was a female. And this animal ate huge amounts of food, and I would get these bags of Purina cat chow, and I'm sorry, pig chow, and that would be finished, and then in the middle of the night, it was like having a baby. The pig would wake up and need to be fed, and would knock against the pillars of the house until he woke me up. She woke me up. It was like an earthquake. And I'd go out, and there'd be pig chow or not. And if there wasn't, I had to empty the refrigerator. I mean, everything. It's just like whole bottles of ketchup and mustard and pickles and deli meats. And, they eat anything. They're omnivores. So the pig grows and grows and grows. And I take the pig to the fair, to the state fair, and I enter Kosher in the state fair. And which happens every August. And Kosher wins sow under 1 year, blue ribbon. No competition, I should add. This is before the farming scene on Martha's Vineyard revived with the local food movement. But I happened to meet there the one other pig owner on the island, or who I thought was the one other pig owner, and that was James Taylor, who he had just become a star. He was like 22, and I was 16. And or maybe he was even younger, and he had a pig named Mona that was a full-grown sow, huge, like 400 or 500 pounds. I don't think people realize that if you don't slaughter pigs when they're like 6 months old, or whenever we slaughter them, they keep growing, and they get really, really big, to the point where you can't really manage them. And Mona was on her way to that status. Anyway, I met James Taylor, and we chatted, talked pig for a while. And the reason I bring that up is because as the end of the summer neared, Kosher was like 175 pounds, and there was just no way that this pig could return to the city. And I had to figure out a home. I needed someone to pig sit for at least for the winter. But there's one adventure that Kosher had that I should share before I get to the ending. And that was that Kosher, as I mentioned, got really hungry and would do anything to eat. And on a couple occasions, he did escape from the pen that was not really that well built by burrowing underneath it. On one occasion, clearly inspired by the scent of a barbecue down the beach, this is a strip of houses on a beach, he gets out and starts heading down the beach. And he's making his way, and I'm like, I don't know, 50 yards behind. He's making his way down the beach and up somebody's steps onto their porch, their deck, where they are grilling a steak. And he knocks over the grill, and he takes the steak and runs off. And there's a guy there sitting with a gin and tonic on the deck grilling. And he is like, am I really seeing this? A pig has come and stolen his dinner. And I felt so bad. And I offered to drive to town to get him another steak. And he was like, no, the story value is worth it. You don't have to do anything. So kosher was going to be trouble. Anyway, so end of the summer comes, have to get rid of the pig. I go looking for homes for the pig. There is one farmer who has pigs, not the kind of pig you would enter in a state fair. Fred Fisher was his name. It was a 2-story barn, and he kept cattle on top, and he had a big chute, and all the cow manure he would shovel down to the first floor, flood it with water, and create this sea of of cow manure. And within that, literally within it, like submarines, were his pigs. And only their heads were above this sea of manure. And the expression "happy as a pig in shit," I
Right.
totally
I was about to
understood
say,
it.
is that true happy or am I horrified? Because I'm sort of horrified.
They looked happy to me, but it definitely wasn't what I envisioned for kosher.
Right.
The white pig. I finally decided I have to ask James Taylor if he'll host my pig, and I somehow through mutual friends managed. It was a small island at the time. Get in touch with him. He says, "Sure, bring over your pig." And I've just learned how to drive, and I have a VW Squareback, and I get a ramp and get kosher up into the back of this car, drive to his house. We put kosher in the pen with Mona, and Mona goes kind of nuts and starts chasing kosher in circles around this pen. And we didn't know that you can't put adult pigs and baby pigs together that aren't related. And that there would be that it just wouldn't work out. And at a certain point, I got kind of nervous, and I said, I think we have to separate them. So James Taylor had just had some kind of accident to his hand. It was all wrapped up. He had a chainsaw accident of some kind. And so he couldn't help me, but I went and he gave me some lumber, and I kind of went off in the woods and tried to build a little enclosure between trees, the fastest way we could make something. And I'm hammering that together, and we go back to get kosher, and kosher's lying there dead. Kosher had had a heart attack or been frightened to death by Mona. James Taylor felt terrible. I mean, here was this kid with his pig, and Mona had killed it. He ultimately wrote a song about Mona, a very funny song about Mona and killing Mona. And according to people I've talked to, he would tell this story at concerts before playing this song for a period of time. So he felt terrible. We buried Mona. I dug a hole, and we buried Mona right there with her blue ribbon from the fair. And that was the end of Kosher
And a
the Pig.
cross or a Jewish star for kosher.
I don't think we had anything. Kosher
Now
should
I
have
feel
had a
kind of
Jewish
bad
star.
about asking that story because it's a good story, but then it has such a sad
I
ending.
know it really does. But what other? I mean, I don't know what kosher's future was going to be like. People have asked, did we eat kosher? But that was just not. That was out of the question. This was a pet.
Right.
Not only that, we now know. I know now from reporting on the pig industry that animals that are stressed before they die don't taste very good. But that
Right.
wasn't the reason.
Well, that wasn't the reason, but I was going to say it is sort of a sense of like why city folk should not be put in charge of
Yes,
agricultural decisions.
I think that's a good bet.
Well, let's turn to city folk and agricultural practices and all the things that you've done. I was thinking when we called you up for this that it's been almost 20 years since you published The Omnivore's Dilemma. It was this
Yeah, that's right. 2 more years.
seminal book. I mean, I think I've told you this story before, I mean, in all my time as a reporter, I think in almost every story, you talk to a chef or you talk to a farmer or you talk to somebody, just a regular everyday person, and they kind of say, and then I read The Omnivore's Dilemma, so it was just it changed everything in the way that we thought and talked about food. And I think before we jump into that and your new film, Fooding Too, I just want to ask one other question, which is sort of at the peak of all of this, it was just so foundational to people. And then you thought, okay, I'm done with food. I'm going to go off and investigate psychedelic drugs. And I think a lot of people, even in food, wondered why. Because most journalists, when they find a niche, especially one that they've been as successful in as you were with food, they stick to it. And I'm curious,
Yeah. Well, first of all,
how and why?
I did stick with it for a while. You recall I then published In Defense of Food and Food Rules and then Cooked. So
Mm-hmm.
I was, and Cooked was 2013. So I was kept writing about it for about 8 or 10 years, and was really very engaged by the topic. And it evolved for me. I got from being interested in agriculture, I got very interested in food itself and in nutrition. I mean, In Defense of Food is really about health and food. So I felt like I had kind of explored it, and all the dimensions, and I was kind of loath to repeat myself. But I also felt like the space got crowded. Lots of people started writing about food, and I'm not saying I'm the first to remember that there were two seminal books before Omnivore's Dilemma. There was Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, which
Right.
was hugely influential and a real surprise bestseller. And then Marion Nestle's book, what was Food Politics, I think comes out also in 2002. So both these books are out there, and something's happening, and I feel like to some extent I caught a wave, or I was able to talk about the issue in a way that reached people that weren't as political as you'd have to be inspired by Eric's book or Marion's book.
Mm-hmm.
But I really like writing at the beginning of my learning curve. That's where I'm really comfortable. And if you read most of my writing, I'm kind of an idiot on page one. I have questions. I don't know what's going on. I've got some mysteries I want to unpack. Um, and I like writing about things lots of people aren't writing about. And so at a certain point, I was just, I wrote, I had written Botany of Desire before the Omnivore's Dilemma, and I
Mm-hmm.
had this general interest in plants and what they do for us and what we do for them. And so I had touched on this idea of plants that change consciousness there in a chapter on cannabis. And I'd always wanted to get back to that. And because I
Mm.
was very intrigued by that very interesting fact that we are drawn to these consciousness changing plants and fungi. Why? What's in it for us? What do they do for us? What does it tell us about consciousness? So those issues were hanging back there pre-food, and then I started hearing about these experiments going on to revive the research into psychedelics. Um, when a beat gets kind of crowded, I want to go somewhere else.
Right.
and
Right.
um, and I also felt, frankly, that I was, dispensable at a certain point. There were a lot of people, yourself included, doing really good journalism about food, and I I also, another thing happens, which is that after you're no longer an idiot and you understand an industry or a field, and you've drawn conclusions about it, you gradually evolve into an advocate, and
Mm-hmm.
that makes the journalistic stance, that complicates the journalistic stance. And at a certain point, you can have access to the op-ed pages all you want, but you lose access to the news pages when you're identified with a movement or a point of view. And
Mm-hmm.
so at a certain point, as I became more of an advocate, and I did get involved in lobbying fights over the farm bill and food safety bill, and um, I became more of an advocate or activist on food issues. I sort of felt my journalism should go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But it
Well,
was
it's
mostly just
interesting.
bump. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but so you and I think that makes a lot of sense because I think for some people, the connection to the conscious changing plants makes more sense because it felt like such a different direction, and the reason makes a lot of sense because you want to be a journalist. But now this month you have a new film out that
Yeah.
are you executive producer?
No, I think I'm producer. Eric and I don't know. But I think I'm producer.
Okay,
Executive.
so you're the
They're
producer of
Yeah, but
Food
I'm
Inc.
not the
too.
director. I'm not the director.
No,
That was Robbie
no.
Kenner and Melissa Robledo.
I
But
should
Eric and
probably
I,
just
yeah, look at the
No, I was
press
just going to say I
release.
should probably just start that question again since so
Okay,
Chris
go
doesn't
ahead.
have to like fix us. I'll just do it. Okay. So you moved on to other things because you wanted to stay a journalist, but now you're back to food. You have there's a new film out, Food Inc. 2 this month. You're a producer on it. This is obviously the sequel to the 2008 documentary Food Inc. So why are you interested again? Why do we need another Food Inc. now?
So Eric and I and Robbie resisted doing a sequel for a long time. Participant, Food Inc., the first Food Inc. did very well, and Participant, who was the producing company, was eager for a sequel, and we were asked to do it many times, and we said no. We said what we have to say. What changed things was the pandemic, and something very interesting with a lot of synchronicity happened in May, I think it was, of 2020, at the very beginning of the pandemic, which is that Eric and I separately, we were not in any kind of contact, both wrote articles about what the pandemic had revealed about the food system.
And I
He
should
wrote
just say this is Eric Schlosser we're talking about
Eric
right now.
Schlosser, author of Fast Food Nation, and he wrote this powerful piece in, I think it was the Atlantic, and I wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books, and they came out like a week apart, and they were making similar points, which is that the pandemic had exposed the extreme brittleness of the food chain. We had been used. I mean, part of the weakness of the critique of food in this country is the shelves are full with lots of stuff, and we have great variety and choice, and price isn't too bad. But that all fell apart in the early weeks of the food chain, and we had this split screen of farmers euthanizing hogs by the thousands, and chickens, and pouring milk onto their farmland. At the same time, you had empty supermarket shelves. And I was kind of perplexed by this and trying to understand what was going on. And gradually realized, oh, well, it's because we have two food chains. We have this institutional food chain that's supplying giant boxes of milk to schools and factories and offices, and liquefied eggs in 10-gallon containers, and toilet paper in these 4-foot wide rolls, 3-foot wide rolls, and that food chain had no connection to the supermarket food chain, and they didn't have the packaging or the machinery to adapt, and things had become that specialized. So as people stopped going to work or school, all that stuff had to be thrown out, basically, and it was. Um, the other thing that was happening that was very revealing of the concentration of the food industry is the power that the meat companies had. And Eric had addressed this. He had looked at what was going on in the meat plants in the high plains and in Iowa, where basically these places where people worked very closely together under brutal conditions had become super spreader sites. And local public health authorities were trying to close them down because they were sending disease back into the communities. And these were unprotected workers, many of them migrants. And we had this amazing illustration of why you don't want monopoly in your political system when John Tyson took out an ad, and both of us wrote about this in our pieces, oddly enough. John Tyson takes out an ad in the New York Times and Washington Post, I think, and Wall Street Journal, asking the president to invoke the Defense Production Act to reopen their lines to keep pork or what Tyson sells all different kinds of meat, keep meat on the shelves. And within a day or two, the president issues an executive order written by Tyson. Now, the Defense Production Act is designed to get companies to do things they don't want to do, like make tanks instead of cars during wartime, in the public interest. Here, it was the very opposite. The Defense Production Act was allowing them to do exactly what they wanted and overrule the local public health authorities. And I mean, this is just absolutely scandalous. And so having both like looked at, okay, the pandemic has pulled back the curtain. We see what concentration is doing. We see what specialization is doing, and what a vulnerable system we have. And we at that point we started talking with Robbie and Melissa and realizing, there is a story to tell here. Things have changed. Levels of concentration have gotten much, much worse, and the American diet has gotten much worse. And that's the other element we looked at that was new, and that was our focus. What's new since 2008 that has to be talked about? Was the incredible rise and new research around ultra processed food, which
Yeah,
now is about 70% of the American diet. And
I know. That's amazing.
it
It's and
is
it's
amazing.
it's 67% of children and teenagers' diets.
Uh,
It's astonishing.
yeah, and we know things about it we didn't know then. I mean, since then, I don't think the term was in use in 2008. It'd be interesting to go back and see. It really was
Yeah.
popularized by this Brazilian epidemiologist that we profile. And he's a very interesting guy, Carlos Monteira, in that he was trying to solve a mystery in Brazil, which was that Brazilians were putting on weight and getting higher rates of diabetes. Yet when he looked at what are called the disappearance numbers of the amount of sugar being used, the amount of fat, the amount of salt, none of that had changed at the gross level. And so he then turned his attention to, well, what's making people fatter? It was the form in which they were getting their food, which was to say it was now ultra processed. They had a fatty diet before. They have these meat stews with a lot of fat in it. They love a lot of sugar in their coffee, and they have a sweet tooth. They bake goods, sweetened. But what had changed was the form of the food, and that began this focus on the degree of processing as a predictor of the lack of health of a food. And we just saw in the papers the other day, the British Medical Journal issued a paper saying that something like 32 diseases have been linked to consumption of ultra processed food.
It's interesting, though, you talk about ultra processed food. I mean, it seems to me it's directly linked to this monopolistic food system that we have, because, of course, these huge companies are answering to shareholders, and the absolute cheapest and way to make food and the most profitable food that you have is the ultra processed stuff, which doesn't have a lot of food in it. So even though they're sort of different strands, they
They're
sort of are of the same
without question.
problem.
Without question, they are connected. I mean, if you are a big multinational company selling food, what you want to do is buy very cheap commodity crops like corn and soy in the main, and turn them into processed foods that are not perishable. The same food can be sold all around the world, and that's the recipe. The more you process food, it's very hard to make money as a farmer. The money is all in processing.
But I mean, without a total spoiler for Food Inc. too, I mean, given the situation that we have where, the president is signing direct, executive orders written by a company,
That
what can
president.
we do?
Well, what we can do is, the what we can do question is really interesting, because when we did Food Inc. 1, we, the kind of solution at the end was essentially voting with your fork, right?
Right.
This was a phrase you heard a lot then. It was popularized by Marion Nestle, and I certainly used it a lot. And the idea was that with our consumer dollars, we could build a new food economy. Now,
Right.
to an extent that happened. There is another food economy, an alternative food economy that's based on local and CSAs and organic and pastured and humane. And it's big. I don't know if it's, somewhere between 50 and $100 billion now, but it mostly feeds the affluent. And it is not going to become the dominant food system. And that, and we didn't know that then. I think we were somewhat naive, frankly. The other thing we didn't know is that the industry would fight tooth and nail for what it has. And Food Inc. had a lot to do with sparking that backlash, because I saw it. I didn't have any kind of issues. The food industry did not come after me after Omnivore's Dilemma. It came after me after 2008 and Food Inc. because, print. But
Nobody reads
movies,
anymore.
yeah,
Yeah.
but movies got their attention. And suddenly the Farm Bureau was organizing campaigns to discredit me and other people in the food movement. I had public appearances, especially at agricultural schools, canceled. And it was found to be pressure from the food industry. This is all documented.
I
Um,
remember that. It was a land grant university, right? And they
Three
said, oh,
of
we're
them,
not going to, yeah.
yeah. One of them was Cal Poly,
Oh, okay.
which is a big California land grant. And I was supposed to give a speech there, and it was canceled. And the L.A. Times, somebody leaked a letter from the president's office that had come from the owner of Harris Ranch, John
Oh,
Harris, which
yeah.
is the big feedlot on Route 5, which I happen to have written about. And he essentially threatened to remove a gift that he'd given them if they allowed me to speak without challenge. And they also forced them to cancel a class on grass feeding of livestock. And this got in the papers, and the president lost his job, as well he should have, for having bent to that. So everything changed. They really started fighting back. They went to every editorial board saying, "Hey, we need equal time to talk about GMOs." Or whatever it is. And, the Eastern media didn't realize there were two sides to the food story for a long time. And they were educated about that, and suddenly became much more, we could say, even-handed. So what can we do now? Well, there's a reason that there are two very prominent legislators that are kind of stars of this film, and that's Cory Booker and John Tester. Change is going to
Mm.
have to come from the government. And one of the positive things that's happened since 2008 is that the movement for reforming the food system has some powerful allies in the U.S. Senate for the very first time. Pat Leahy was a friend of organic agriculture, so it's not like there was nobody there. But here you have this urban legislator, Cory Booker, who comes out of Newark, who is on the ag committee,
Yeah.
because he realizes that the public health problems of his constituents are linked to the agricultural policy. That's a huge step forward. And he deeply understands these issues and how all the dots are connected. And John Tester, who is the only working farmer in Congress right now, or in the Senate, has been fighting for protection of producers in the face of monopoly, and as well as for food safety. He pioneered the food safety bill. So the next wave of change is going to have to come from Washington. That
Which is
probably
a little
doesn't.
bit scary to say right
Yeah.
now. I mean, because it's funny, you answered my next question without me having to ask it, which was, okay, we got some of the way, but clearly this film is an admission that consumer behavior change is not enough. So, and if we have to kick it to Washington, that's a little
Well, look,
scary.
it is. It is. But a couple of things give me hope. One is having powerful allies like that. The other is the fact that the Biden administration actually has a much more aggressive antitrust policy than previous administrations in our
Right.
lifetime. And that, at the FTC is Lena Khan, who, as a law student, wrote a landmark piece about concentration in agriculture. And then she wrote a great piece for the Washington Monthly about chicken farmers and how the farmers become indentured to the Purdue's of this world. And then you have Jonathan Cantor in the Justice Department, and we'll see how they do. They're up against enormous opposition. Um, but they did block this merger of Albertsons with Kroger's.
Right.
And we'll see what they do with the meat packers. I mean, that's the one you want to watch, because you have this situation in beef where, 86% of the market is controlled by four companies, and they essentially divvy up, the ranch lands of America, so that if you're a rancher, realistically, there's only one person to sell to, and that turns you into a price taker. And so you have
Right.
these companies, and I think that the average viewer or listener or citizen doesn't understand that the reason we have antitrust laws in this country, going back to the robber baron era, is not just to protect consumers from price fixing. In fact, the word consumer does not appear in the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was initially to protect producers who were being abused by these very few companies who were around to buy their produce, whatever it is, and to protect the political system for these undue concentrations of power. And in 1980, under the Reagan administration, the policy, not the legislation, but the policy was changed so that the standard for bringing an antitrust action was harm to consumers. Um, that idea, which the Biden administration can lift, and it seems like they have in effect lifted it. So that's all. That's all progress. I mean, we need a second Biden administration, frankly, for them to get very far. Breaking up the food industry. And it won't, obviously, if Trump is elected, it won't happen.
Right.
But there's some reason for hope,
I
and
mean,
that's
it's
one of the
interesting.
reasons for intervening now, and getting the story out there. I mean, the film is a very strong piece of advocacy, and we felt like this is a key moment. And
Well, and John Tester himself is in a tough race
he
right
is,
now.
he is.
So it's good for people who may not be following Montana state politics to be aware
That
of
yes, and that
the work that he's doing.
he's a very important ally, and yeah, I think we all should be supporting him.
I want to ask one more question about politics, which is just simply you mentioned the Biden administration and their work on antitrust. You were relatively critical of the Obama administration back in the day. What grade would you give the Biden administration on food issues?
I don't know enough to say. I don't know what's going on with school lunches in this administration. There's a lot I'm not close enough to say. I mean, I would give
Okay.
them a B plus on antitrust, and that's after giving a D to Obama. I was disappointed in Obama, because I think he understands all these issues, and he understands both the importance of diet to health, and the importance of agriculture policy to our diet. That these things are. I mean, he's a great dot connector, and he got it. What did he do about it? Well, Michelle Obama did a lot. She did some important work around school lunch, and I think that the organic garden in the White House was a important symbolic step. Although she never called it an organic garden, but it was an organic garden. Um, why did she not call it an organic garden? The carefulness of the Obamas, we can say. Um, but he started looking at this antitrust issue, and he had this listening tour in 2010, where both his Secretary of Agriculture and Justice went around listening to farmers talk about their problems and how they were treated by the buyers of their commodities, and the monopolies on seeds. And they persuaded farmers to really step out and testify at great risk to themselves, and they promised to do something. But after the midterms, where
The
Obama got
shellacking.
the shellacking, and he was depicted as anti-business, he just dropped that whole initiative. And who was it? Christine Barney, who was his fairly aggressive antitrust person in justice. She quit because she knew nothing was going to happen for the rest of his administration. And indeed, on that front, nothing did happen. So, yeah, that was disappointing. I mean, I understand the politics of it. This is a very tough issue. But Biden has shown so far, more mettle on that issue than Obama did.
Let me ask you, I want to end on one last question, which is for budding food journalists or veteran food journalists, what kinds of food stories are you still curious about in 2024? Where would you direct them to look?
Oh, that's such a good question. I used to teach food journalism in my writing classes, and I thought a lot about this then. I mean, there are still so many great stories, and they're old stories that need to be renewed. Pesticides, for example, we don't hear a lot about pesticides. There's still a tremendous problem. I just heard the other day that Iowa is now number 2 in cancer rates. They've just shot up, and it cannot be explained by the usual causes of obesity and smoking rates and things like that. It clearly is tied to, well, we don't know for sure. It's not that clear. Nitrates in the water. They're all drinking fertilizer now, and in Iowa, and pesticides. The profligate spraying of glyphosate over crops that never received glyphosate before, including wheat crops, by the way, right before we eat them, get sprayed with glyphosate now just to kill them and dry them out. So, some of those old stories need to be looked at. We think of pesticides as an old story. I think that cultured meat continues to be an interesting story. I think it's kind of a Potemkin story, and what's happening with various forms of synthetic meat. I think that more, Joe Fassler did a great investigation of that. And there's a lot of room in this wave of innovation coming out of Silicon Valley. That's where a lot of the capital has come from. I think the Silicon Valley relationship to food is really interesting. I mean, these guys who think that having figured out software, they can figure out anything, have very naively gone into food where the margins are tiny, and
Yeah.
it's a tougher business in many ways, but they think it can be disrupted like anything else. So watching that, I think, is very interesting, and watching this research around ultra processed food play out. There's a lot of research going on. We don't understand exactly what it is about ultra processed food that makes it so deleterious to our health. And there's studies underway that will be interesting to report on.
Yeah. Well, listen, Michael Pollan, we wish you were still on the beat, but
Well, I
thank you so
am.
very
I
much.
did this movie.
You did this movie. That's right. Okay. You get a pass for 2024. How about
Okay.
that?
Thank
But
you.
more later. But listen, thank you for joining us. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate it.